Good morning, everybody. It's Reva with Quality Sewing and Vacuum, and we have a wonderful, wonderful session for you today. We're doing something a little bit different. We have a live guest with us, and what I want to ask you is that if you have any questions on the topic, which I haven't told you yet, but you probably read it, go ahead and put those in the chat so that way we can have your questions answered. So today we are going to be talking about doing pattern drafting and modifications to pattern drafting. And I want you to meet our guest. Our guest is Cornelius Quiring, and he is joining us from Canada. And he is a wonderful YouTube and TikTok and Instagram sewing star. And I just really am excited that you're here, Cornelius. Welcome.
Well, thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure to be able to participate.
Yeah, well, you're more than participating. You're the star of our show today. So I hope you just don't want to just participate, but we're going to have a lot of time. So now I want to get to know you a little bit more, and I'm sure that our friends out there want to get to know you a little bit more as well. Now, you've been doing things with us for about 9 months now, which is really fun. We love having you work with us, and I'm sure some of you have seen, and hopefully all of you have seen, some of his videos on YouTube and everything. I love the way that you present things. They're very easy to follow, but they're fun to watch. So I appreciate that very much. But how did you get started doing the whole social media thing?
Well, it was for two reasons. I like to entertain. I found that to be something that I've been doing since I've been growing up. And I also like to make things. And it just so happens that I was born in the right time in history where I can do it myself and I don't have to be dependent on a network. And so that's where it all started. It gave me the chance to create things that I love and share them in an enjoyable way.
Well, that's cool. So now today we're talking about pattern modifications. So now, do you have a history? What's your history with sewing? Let's start with just sewing. What's your history with sewing?
Well, if I may just take us back to when I was a 3-year-old boy, I had an accident, and as a result of it, the right side of my body there's certain muscle groups that didn't develop. And as I grew up, I realized that clothes are our outside skin. They're the bit that we can control. And so that's where my interest in fashion came from. And then more specifically, the actual making of clothes, because I realized that why buy things off the rack when I can just create what I want for myself. And so that's where the journey started, learning how to not only sew clothes, but then also to modify patterns and then eventually draft my own patterns in a way where they're unique. And so, for example, my right sleeve is usually 1.5 inches smaller than my left sleeve. So if anyone ever tries on my clothes, they're always not quite sure why it's a little bit uncomfortable until I mention those differences.
That's really fascinating. That's really cool, because sewing can give us the ability to modify things specifically for ourselves and for others. So thank you for sharing that story. That's really a good reason to get into sewing, to make things just the way you want them to be. Okay, so what are we going to talk about today? Or I should just let you get into it, right? So, because I know one thing that people struggle with the most, and I know a lot of people that learned how to sew in home ec, and we had to make these horrible things that we were forced to make during home ec. And a lot of people have gotten away from sewing for sewing garments because they feel that the patterns don't fit right. They can't get a result that makes them happy. So they resort to quilting, which quilting is fun and it's beautiful. You get to play with all the fabric, but it's really rewarding to have a garment that you created yourself. So I'm hoping that people will really find what you have to say today that resonates with them, so they're able to go on that next journey. So I'm going to turn it over to you and let you just go for it.
All right. Well, first, I don't know if it was just you, but I certainly like the pajamas that I made in sewing class in school. But we all have our things. I'm going to go through 5 different tips that I've put together for pattern drafting. And the first one that I'm going to start with is the idea of translating your 2D patterns into a garment. And I find that there's a bit of a disconnect there, in that when you look at it, you have these shapes that are flat, but the garment that we're wearing is a 3D item. And learning how one translates to the other can sometimes be a bit challenging. And I discovered this one accidentally for myself, but I found that doing little paper mock-ups really helps to understand those shapes. And so the way the patterns are usually with tissue paper, I like to take just good old-fashioned printer paper, and I will cut out a rough approximation of whatever the pattern piece is. And the first one I ever did this with, and to me still continues to be a great example, is a sleeve. And so just drawing out a sleeve pattern, and while we sew a sleeve together on the sides like this, we then get to see what that shape actually looks like. And we end up finding out that if we flip this on its side, that a sleeve is really just a cylinder that has been cut at an angle. And so that curve at the top there is just the result of cutting a tube, right? So if I take this again and open it back up, you now understand this curvature here. But now that we get that, of course, we can now go ahead and play with that shape, right? And so, for example, if I twist that back up again, if I want my sleeve to point a little further down, to be a little bit more formal, well, then that angle we cut at is just going to be more extreme, which just means a more extreme curvature. And vice versa, if we want the sleeve pointing a bit more out for a bit more of a casual fit, well, then that becomes a more shallow shape. And so I find little paper mock-ups with this and then just taping them together really helps. I've done this with like a shirt pattern, for example, with pants, and that allows me to connect the flat pattern to the actual garment itself. Tip number 2 is what I call the slash method. And so now this is where we're going to get into actually modifying a pattern itself. And so I've once again got myself a little paper mock-up here. I've gone real simple. And this is half of the front of a shirt. This would, of course, get duplicated over when we're doing the full garment. So we have our neck here, the shoulder, the sleeve. And let's say that this is just too small for us. It's a little tight and we need a little more girth out to the sides. Well, I've drawn myself a line here, top to bottom. I go ahead and slash it. It's where the slash technique idea comes from. And then that, I can now go ahead and space it out as much as I want. And then I tape it down onto another piece of paper. I would redraw my shoulder line at the top here. I would draw it in at the bottom, and then I can go ahead and just cut this out. And I've got my new pattern piece. I would do the same amount for the back panel as well, because of course we need them to stay the same. But I can also do it in the opposite direction. Like I can slash and then make things smaller. So I would just bring this panel and this panel over top, overlapping each other, redraw the two, and I've got myself a smaller piece.
Okay, so on that idea, Cornelius, with the taking the pattern and slashing it, let's say it's after Thanksgiving and we've eaten more than our share of pumpkin pie. I would think then at that point we would keep the shoulder the same and you'd pivot out the pumpkin pie eating area.
If I didn't know any better, I'd say you had stolen my next topic.
Oh, good lead into the next thing. Okay, let's see what's next.
It's a slightly different version of what you're talking about, but I was going to use, it's the same concept. I'm going to do it with the sleeve though. And let's say I have a sleeve here. This is my regular sleeve. It fits my shirt nicely. And I want to turn it into a puff sleeve. Well, in this case, I've done multiple slashes, which I can then fan out like this. So I keep it the same in the bottom, and then those are just my pivot points rather than doing the even spacing. And then I can go ahead and redraw my curve at the top here and then cut it out. And voila, I have myself a puff sleeve. And then we could do the exact same thing with the garment as well that you're talking about. We could do that. I have half a top here. So say we want a little more volume for our tummies because it was a yummy turkey. Well, then I can just cut straight across here. This would be my pivot point. I can go ahead and pivot the bottom out a little bit, which would kind of add that triangle shape again. And then I just go ahead and clean up my line, make that a nice straight one up through the sides, and voila, no one will know that we had the tastiest of turkeys. And then moving on to tip number 3, and this is measure on the stitch line. And so this was a mistake that I made earlier on in my pattern drafting days, is I didn't realize that patterns often come with the seam allowance baked in. And so if I'm going to be making modifications, the key is to make sure that if there's a measurement required, that I always measure on the stitch line. And so I'm just going to return to the sleeve example again, because this works well to demonstrate what I want. Is in my sample here, I've drawn my own pattern, but I've also gone ahead and drawn in my stitch lines, and then I have my seam allowance on the outside. And so if I were to, for example, need to adjust the curvature at the top here, say I've been drafting my pattern and it's just the sleeve's a little bit too small, I would be measuring along here to make sure that matches the stitch line on my patterns as well. And so I do that for every piece. Turn that around so it's the right direction. So you'll see it on my 2 pattern pieces here. I have them drawn in again, right? And so that top curve on my sleeve, I want to match the length of this stitch line here and this one here if I add them together. And so the important thing being there, measuring on the stitch line, so that way they will equal each other. And so when we make modifications, sometimes that can get tweaked a little bit. We measure along there, make sure it's the right length or adjust as need be. And that way, when we actually sew our pattern together, it'll fit nicely. Otherwise, there may be times where you're wondering, why isn't it fitting together? Most likely that is the reason. And tip number 4 is what I call the 90-degree rule. Let me return to my piece of paper here. And the idea is essentially that when we have pattern pieces, we want the corners of the 2 pattern pieces where they join up to be a perfect 90-degree angle. And so I've got my front piece here and my back piece here. And now, mind you, I don't have seam allowance included here because it's easier to demonstrate what I'm talking about. But the simplest of examples would be, say, the bottom corner here. You see how I have a nice 90-degree corner? Same thing on the other one. When I go ahead and sew these pieces together, there's going to be a nice smooth transition from one to the other. It's a very simple demonstration of it. But to take it one step further would be at the sleeve at the top here. So in this curve here, at the very edge here, I have a nice 90-degree corner. And then I have another one on this side as well. And so that way, when the 2 join up, I get a nice smooth transition from one to the next. And it doesn't have to be a terribly long distance for that 90-degree transition from one to the other, but just enough so that it smoothly goes from one to the other. If it isn't, I end up getting a bit of a pinch at the bottom there or a pucker. And when I go to sew it together, it's going to look a little odd underneath. And so there's many places within the patterns we're going to want that. However, it isn't always possible to be a perfect 90-degree angle. There's going to be times where it's different. And this brings me to tip number 5, which is the 180-degree rule. So basically, if we take 90 plus 90, it gives us 180, which is the straight line that we talk about. So in more complex areas, I just focus on the 180-degree rule, meaning I want a smooth transition from one to the other, and then those 2 can be different. So back to this example one more time. I have my neck hole here, and this is clearly not a 90-degree angle, right? And then on the back by the neck, well, this is clearly more, but then if I add the two together, I'm going to get that perfect 180 that I was talking about. So if I join my two shoulders together, there's that nice smooth transition from one to the other. And again, it doesn't have to be a very long distance. It can just be a short amount for a slight distance there, but having that 180 degree helps to get the smooth transition from the front to the back. And so when I go and sew on a collar, for example, I'm not going to get a weird pull or pucker in that corner. And those are my 5 tips, basic tips that I have to think about when pattern drafting. And I find those ones have got me a long way in improving my skill sets.
Yeah, no, that makes total sense, because that's where we get those errors, like you were talking about the 90 and the 180, is because if they don't match together, then nothing goes right the rest of the time. So that makes total sense. Now, Carolyn had a question, and she, I know we're not going to get into specific drafting, editing things, but what's a general thing that you can do if someone wants to have longer sleeves or longer lengths of pants or skirts? And I assume that that would be the same as shortening too. The process would be similar.
I would do this exact same sort of thing, but flipped this way, of course. Let's say this is the top of my, you know what? Actually, I have a sleeve right here. Why don't I pull that out? So say, for example, I wanted to lengthen this sleeve. I would simply just cut along here, and then I would pull this down as much as I need to lengthen it. And then I go ahead and I just redraw the line on the sides again. And voila, I have myself a longer sleeve. The same sort of technique is going to apply to pants as well. So I would probably around the knees, I would go ahead and just cut a slash across and bring it down as much as I want, and then just redraw in the lines on the sides. And depending on the style of pants that you have, there may be a slight curvature on the sides. And the key is just to get a nice smooth transition from one back into the other again. And so just allow a nice gentle line to connect them again.
Well, very good. Thank you. And if anyone's out there wondering, why is it that you cut in the middle or at the thigh? It's because then you're not messing with the crotch, you're not messing with the hem or a placket or the top. It's in the middle, kind of in that, it's more adjustable within that middle range.
Right. And I'm going to have less changes to the shape of my pattern in terms of because this line on the side here, when I redraw it, is going to be ever so slightly different than it is right now. And so by doing it in the middle, it just gives me more room to smooth out the transition from one to the other and still keeping the shape roughly the same.
Yeah, that's great. No, I think this has been so helpful. And I know that, there's many of us that when you get a commercial pattern, of course, measure carefully. You don't want to get a commercial pattern your size, because commercial pattern sizing is not human being sizing. So look at your measurements, right? And then take some of these things that if it's not the right thing, 'cause sometimes there might be the arm is too tight. The measurement doesn't fit. So then you can do that slash technique that you were talking about. And maybe even take a garment that you like the fit of and compare its finished size measurement to the finished size of the actual pattern piece might be helpful.
Yeah, I've done that as well. I take apart a pair of pants that I got at a thrift store. I got them for the fit. They were really, really nice. And so then that way I could learn what the shape of the pattern was, and is a great way to learn as well.
That's a great idea. Well, these are good basics and for getting the right fit and modifying patterns. So thank you so much for that. And I know that if you have more questions, and some people watch this on replay, so we will try to get your questions answered if you put them in the comments later. But please visit Cornelius on his YouTube and Instagram channel, and also on TikTok, TikTok, and I know that you're going to enjoy his videos. They're very well done. They're humorous, but they have a lot of good information. And I thank you so much for teaming up with us, and I just love watching your videos. So thank you for making them, because that gives us all something enjoyable to learn from. So I guess with that, we're going to say thank you, and we will see everyone back here next week at our next How Do I. But Cornelius, thank you so much. Appreciate you joining us, and we look forward to many more opportunities of learning from you.
Well, thank you for having me. It was an honor to be here. I feel like I finally made it now that I'm on a live show. So,
and you're in Western Washington, not in Canada right now. But of course, you're on YouTube, so you're everywhere. So,
well, thank you very much for having me. This was fun.
Oh, thank you, Cornelius. Appreciate your time. So everybody else, please enjoy watching this over and over to get all the tips, and watch it on our YouTube channel. And then we'll see you again here next week for our next How Do I?